The wind came down off the ridge at 4 in the morning, like it had a grudge, and it found the boy first. It always found the boy first. Marcus Hale stood at the edge of a parking lot behind the shuttered hardware store on County Route 9, his breath tearing white from his mouth, a snow shovel frozen to his bare red hands, and he watched the big man go down. The man was huge, even folded against the brick wall, even sliding sideways with one boot, scrabbling for purchase that the ice would not give. He was huge. Leather over his shoulders, a vest gone stiff with cold, a beard packed with snow. His bike lay on its side 6 feet away, the engine ticking as it died, the headlamp throwing a long cone of yellow across a drift that was already swallowing it. The man's hand was pressed to his ribs. His face had gone the color of the sky. Marcus did not think. That was the thing he would turn over later in the warm months when people asked him how a 15-year-old boy ended up where he ended up. He did not weigh it. He dropped the shovel and ran across 40 feet of black ice in sneakers with a hole worn through the left toe, and he got his shoulder under the man's arm before the man hit the ground, and he held. He held a man twice his weight, and his knees buckled. And he did not let go. That was December. To understand why 50 engines would shake the snow off the pines in April, you have to go back to that December and to the long, cold nothing that came before it. Marcus lived with his mother in the bottom half of a rented house, on the wrong edge of a town called Cold Harbor, up where the state forgot to plow until noon, and the jobs had followed the mill out of the valley 20 years gone. His father was a name on a child support order that had not been honored since Marcus was 9. His mother, Dana, cleaned rooms at a highway motel 40 minutes each way and came home smelling of bleach and other people's cigarettes. And some nights she sat at the kitchen table with the bills fanned out in front of her, like a hand of cards she could not win, and she did not cry where he could see. But he heard the chair creak when she put her face down on her arms. So Marcus shoveled. He had started at 12, going door to door with a bent shovel after the first big storm, asking $5 a driveway and taking 3 when 3 was offered. By 15, he had a route. He knew which old people on Birch Street would pay him in cookies and which would pay him in cash, and he took the cookies the same as the cash, because a thing freely given is still a thing, and his mother had taught him that. He was up before the buses ran. He cleared walks so men could get to trucks so they could drive to work, and he was invisible to almost all of them. A thin boy in a coat, 2 sizes too small, bending into the wind, and he had made a kind of peace with being invisible. The man against the brick wall was not invisible. The man was the most visible thing Marcus had ever touched. His name, Marcus would learn, was Ray Doyle, though no one had called him Ray in 30 years. They called him Tombstone, for the slab of granite he had carved and set over an empty grave for a brother who had never come home from a war, back when the club was young. He was the road captain of an outfit called the Ash Saints, and he was 61 years old, and a sheet of black ice on County Route 9 had done what 3 decades of highway had never managed. It had put him down. "Don't," Tombstone said. His voice came out of him in pieces. "Don't move me." "You're freezing," Marcus said. "You'll freeze right here. I've been colder." "Not laying in it, you haven't." Marcus did not know where the words came from. They came out steady, and they surprised him as much as they surprised the old man, whose eyes had cracked open and were looking at the boy now with a flat, assessing patience, like a man reading weather. "There's a doorway. Hardware store. It's out of the wind. I can't carry you, but I can hold you up while you walk it." Tombstone looked at him a long moment. Snow gathered in his beard. Somewhere, a long way off, a plow scraped a road. That was not this one. It took them 11 minutes to cross 40 feet. Marcus counted later. The way you count a thing that almost killed you. 11 minutes, the boy's whole body shaking, the man's arm a dead iron weight across his shoulders, the both of them grunting and slipping and stopping, while the old man breathed through whatever was broken in his side. They reached the recessed doorway of the hardware store where the wind could not reach, and Marcus got him down against the door with his back to the steel, and then Marcus did 3 things. He took off his own too small coat and put it over the man's legs. He ran back out into the wind, set the fallen motorcycle's headlamp upright so it would not drain dead, and dragged the bike a foot clear of the road's edge where a plow would clip it. And then he pulled the flip phone held together with electrical tape out of his jeans and he called for help. He stayed on his knees in the doorway in a thin sweatshirt for 51 minutes until the ambulance found them, talking the whole time because somewhere he had read that you keep a cold man talking. He talked about his shovel route. He talked about a dog he wanted and could not have. He talked about his mother, a little before he caught himself. The old man said almost nothing. Once, near the end, when the boy's teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak, Tombstone reached over with one huge scarred hand and gripped the back of the boy's neck, the way you would steady a colt, and held it there. And that was all. When the paramedics loaded him, Tombstone caught the kid's sleeve. "What do I owe you?" he said. It was not a question in the world the old man came from. It was the only thing that mattered. "Nothing," Marcus said. He was shivering too hard to stand. "You don't owe me nothing. Anybody would have." The old man's eyes did something then. They went hard and bright at the same time, the way a man's eyes go when a thing he stopped believing in turns out to still be true. "No," Tombstone said. "Anybody wouldn't have." They closed the doors. The ambulance pulled out into the white. Marcus walked home in the dark in his sweatshirt and let himself in quiet, so his mother would not wake and worry, and he hung his wet clothes over the bathtub, and he went to bed, and by morning he had half decided he had dreamed the whole thing. He did not own the coat anymore. That was the only proof it had happened. He had given his coat to a stranger and walked home cold, and his mother would ask about the coat, and he did not yet know what he would tell her. He told her he lost it. She looked at him a long time across the kitchen. This woman who knew her son did not lose things because he could not afford to lose things, and she did not call him a liar. She gave him his father's old barn coat from a box in the closet, which smelled of a man neither of them spoke about, and she said nothing else, and Marcus went out on his route the next morning, swimming in canvas that hung to his knees, and the world went on. He did not expect to see the old man again. People like that did not come back to a place like Cold Harbor. They passed through it on their way, to somewhere with weather. The first envelope came in January. It was in the mailbox with the gas bill, no stamp, no return address, just Marcus printed in block letters by a hand that did not write often. Inside was a single sheet of paper and $300 in 20s. The paper said, "For the coat and the route. A man pays his debts." Underneath, smaller. "We are not done." Dana found him sitting on the porch steps holding it, and the story came out of him in pieces the way the old man's voice had come out of him, the doorway. And when he was done, his mother sat down hard on the step beside him and put the money in his hands and folded his fingers over it and said, "We don't keep money. We don't understand, Marcus." But she did not make him give it back because there was no one to give it back to, and because $300 was the difference between the heat staying on and the heat going off, and she was a practical woman who had run out of pride somewhere around a third winter alone. They kept the money, the heat stayed on, and Marcus began, against his own better sense, to wait for the second thing the note had promised. It did not come the way he expected. Nothing about the Ash Saints ever came the way he expected. What came instead was a problem, and the problem had a name, and the name was Gerald Voss. Gerald Voss owned half of Cold Harbor and wanted the rest. He owned the Highway Motel where Dana cleaned rooms. He owned the strip of dead storefronts on Route 9, the hardware store included, all of it bought cheap and held empty for the tax write-down, while he waited for the county to widen the road and triple his land's worth. He owned a glass-fronted office in the new development out by the interstate, and he wore suits the color of slate, and he drove a German car the color of a gun, and he had never in his life held a shovel. He was the kind of man who had learned early that the law was a tool, and that a man who could afford lawyers never had to afford a conscience. And that January, Gerald Voss decided he was going to take the house Dana Hale rented, because it sat on the last lot he needed to package the whole block for the developers. And the woman who owned it, an 80-year-old widow named Ruth Petrosky, would not sell. Marcus learned this the way the powerless always learn things, which is too late, and by accident. He was clearing Ruth Petrosky's walk on a Tuesday, taking his cookies and his $3, when he found the old woman at her kitchen table with a letter in front of her. And she was not the kind to cry either, but her hands were shaking, and she let him read it. It was a lawyer's letter. It said a great many things in a great many words, but the bones of it were these. Ruth Petrosky owed $11,000 in back taxes and assessments accumulated over years, much of it in fees and penalties that had appeared somehow only recently. The letter offered to buy the house and clear the debt. The offer was for a fraction of the home's worth, and the letter noted in the cold, flat language of men who have never been cold that if Mrs. Petrosky declined, the county would proceed to a tax sale, at which point the property could be acquired by any qualified bidder, and the implication, unspoken and total, was that the qualified bidder was already chosen and his name was Voss. "I have lived here 60 years, Ruth said. My Walter built the back porch with his own hands. I am not going to a home to die in a hallway because some man wants a parking lot." And Dana rented the bottom half of a house 2 doors down that Voss also wanted, on the same block, and the same machine was grinding toward her too. Slower, but no less sure. If Ruth fell, the block fell, and Dana and Marcus fell with it. Marcus went home that night and did the math at the kitchen table the way his mother did. The bills fanned out and the math did not work. It never worked. $11,000 was the moon. $300 in 12s had felt like a fortune in December, and now it was a thimble against the sea. There was no shoveling your way out of Gerald Voss. There was no door you could prop a man in. The coal that Voss brought did not answer to Coates. So Marcus did the only thing left to a boy with no power and a debt that ran the other direction. He wrote a letter back. He did not have. He addressed it to the only place he could think of, a roadhouse 40 miles down the valley that everyone knew the Ash Saints kept, and he wrote it plain, the way the old man had written him. He did not ask for money. That was the thing his mother would be proudest of. Later, when she understood what he had done, he did not ask for a dime. He wrote down what was happening to Ruth Petrosky, and to the block, and to his mother, And he wrote down the name Gerald Voss, and he wrote that he was not asking for anything for himself, that the debt was paid, the coat was square, but that he thought a man who paid his debts might want to know that a thief was using the law like a crowbar on an 80-year-old woman, and that the boy who had held him up in the doorway could not hold this one up alone. He mailed it, with a stamp he could not afford, and he did not tell his mother. And for 3 weeks nothing happened at all. Then the cold broke, the way it does in the mountains, sudden and false, a week of melt in February that turns the world to mud and lies about spring. And on a Thursday afternoon, a man in a slate-gray suit walked into the Highway Motel where Dana Hale was cleaning room 14, and he did not knock. Marcus was there. School had let out early for a teacher day, and he had ridden the bus the 40 minutes to help his mother turn rooms so she could get home before dark for once. He was in the bathroom of room 14, with a rag and a bottle of blue cleaner, when he heard the man's voice in the other room, smooth and certain, and he froze. "You understand the position," Voss was saying. "The building's being sold. New ownership, new staff. I'm told you're reliable. I could put in a word. But reliability cuts both ways, Mrs. Hale. The tenants on Birch make this complicated. People who make my life complicated tend to find their own lives get complicated. I'm sure you follow." "I follow," Dana said. Her voice was the controlled, even voice. Marcus knew, the one that meant she was holding something down with both hands. "The Petrowski woman listens to you. The whole block listens to you for some reason. A word from you that's selling is sensible, that's all. And your son keeps his little snow business, and you keep your job, and everyone stays warm." A pause. The squeak of a man sitting on the edge of a made bed without being asked. "Or they don't. I'd hate for the boy to be out in the cold." That was the moment. Marcus would think about that moment for the rest of his life. The man in the suit had said the boy, and the boy was standing 8 feet away with a rag in his hand and his heart going like a hammer. And the boy understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and never left him, that this was not a man who would ever stop. You could give Gerald Voss the block, and he would want the valley. You could give him the valley, and he would want the boy's silence on top of it, just to be sure, just because he could. Marcus put down the rag. He walked out of the bathroom, and he said the bravest stupid thing of his life. "Get out of my mother's room," he said. Voss turned. He looked at the boy the way you look at a thing that has gotten on your shoe. He was a handsome man, going soft, with a tan that came from a machine and teeth that came from a dentist. And he smiled. And the smile had nothing behind it. "This isn't your mother's room," he said gently. "That's rather the whole point." He stood. He straightened his cuffs. He walked out past the boy close enough that Marcus could smell the cologne of him, expensive and cold, and at the door he paused and looked back, and for the first time something flickered in his face that was not contempt. It was curiosity. He had seen the set of the boy's jaw, and a man like Voss had spent a lifetime learning to read exactly that, the moment a cornered thing decides it would rather break than kneel. And it interested him, the way a problem interests a man who has solved every problem he ever met. "Tell me," Voss said, "what is it you think you're going to do?" Marcus did not answer, because Marcus did not know. Denned. Outside, the false spring dripped off the motel eaves, and somewhere, 40 miles down the valley, a letter had been read aloud in a low room that smelled of stale beer and old leather and raw exhaust. And the answer to the question Voss had just asked was already coming, though no one in that motel room could yet hear it. The answer took 6 more weeks to arrive, and they were the longest 6 weeks of the boy's life. The pressure came down on the block like weather. Ruth Petrowski's tax bill grew a fresh penalty no one could explain. A code inspector, none of them had ever seen, condemned the railing on her front steps and left a notice that another would follow. Dana's hours at the motel were cut, then cut again, the schedule posted later and later, so she could not plan around it. The small cruelties of a man who never had to raise his voice. A truck Marcus did not recognize idled at the end of Birch Street some evenings, just sitting, just being seen. Voss never appeared himself. He did not have to. He had built his whole life so that he would never have to be the one standing in the cold. And Marcus kept shoveling, except now there was nothing to shovel because the false spring had taken the snow, so he found other work hauling and clearing and fixing, anything that put a few dollars on the kitchen table, because if the heat went off now they were done, and he understood that Voss was counting on exactly that, counting on the slow grind, counting on the simple arithmetic of poverty that says the powerful can always wait longer than the poor can. What Marcus did not know, what none of them knew, was that down the valley a man named Tombstone had spent those 6 weeks not waiting at all. The Ash Saints were not what the suits imagined when they imagined men like that. They were welders and long-haul drivers and a retired machinist, a man who had done 2 tours and come home wrong and slowly come right again among them, a woman who kept their books and had once been an accountant for a firm that had taught her exactly how men like Gerald Voss hid what they did. They had a clubhouse that had once been a feed store cinder block, and a long-scarred bar, and a wall of photographs of men who were gone. And they had a code, and the code was old and simple and had only one real article, which was that a debt is a debt, and that the measure of a man is what he does about the ones that cannot be measured in money. The boy had given the road captain his coat, and asked for nothing. In the arithmetic of the Ash Saints, that was not a small thing. That was the whole thing. That was the only kind of debt that could never be fully paid, and therefore the only kind a man like Tombstone took entirely seriously. So they did not send money. Money was what Voss understood, and you do not fight a man on the ground he owns. Instead, the woman, who had once been an accountant, pulled threads. She pulled the thread of Ruth Petrowski's tax bill and found the penalties had been added by a clerk in the county assessor's office, whose brother-in-law happened to be a partner in Voss's development holding. She pulled the thread of the code inspector and found he had been hired 6 weeks earlier on a contract that ran through a shell company 3 layers deep, every layer leading back to the same slate-gray office by the interstate. She pulled the thread of the tax sale and found the whole thing, the entire elegant machine, the bought clerks and the manufactured fees and the foreordained buyer, and she wrote it all down, every date and every dollar and every name, the way Voss himself wrote things down in the cold, flat language of men who keep records. And she made copies. And the copies went into a safe in a feed store that no longer sold feed, and then they waited for the date that mattered. Because there was one date that Voss had built his whole machine around, and it was the date of the public tax sale, the day the county would auction Ruth Petrowski's home on the courthouse steps, the day the law would do quietly and legally what no thief could do with a crowbar. It was set for the 2nd Saturday in April. Voss would not even attend. He would send a man with a number, and the number would win because no one in Cold Harbor had $11,000, and the gavel would fall, and it would all be perfectly legal, and that was the beauty of it, the thing that let Gerald Voss sleep at night in a house with a view of the valley he was eating. It was all perfectly legal. The 2nd Saturday in April came up warm and bright, Real spring at last, the snow gone to runoff and the runoff gone to green, and Marcus stood on the courthouse steps beside his mother and Ruth Petrovsky and maybe 30 people from the block, and they had no money and no lawyer and no plan. Only the stubborn animal need to be present when the thing they loved was taken, so that it would at least be taken in front of witnesses. A man in a brown suit Marcus had never seen stood off to one side with a paddle and a bored expression. Voss's number, the foreordained winner. The county clerk read the legal description of the property in a flat voice. Ruth Petrovsky held Dana's arm. Marcus stared at the brown suit and felt the old helplessness rise in him like cold water, the certainty that the powerful always win, that the law is a thing they own, that a boy with a shovel cannot stop the moon. And then he heard it. He felt it first, actually, in his chest, before his ears made sense of it. A low vibration in the bright spring air, far off and growing, a sound he had heard exactly once before on a December night, ticking as it died in the snow. Except this was not one engine. This was many. This was a sound like the ground itself clearing its throat, rolling up the valley road and into the town, and the bored man in the brown suit lifted his head, and the clerk lost his place, and every person on the courthouse steps turned toward the sound, and around the corner came the Ash Saints. They came in formation, 2 by 2, chrome throwing the spring sun in hard white bars, leather and beard and the long, low thunder of them, and they did not come as 10 or as 20. Marcus tried to count and lost the count. The line of them came around the corner and kept coming, filling the street, and the windows of the shops shook in their frames, and the pigeons went up off the courthouse roof in a gray panic, and the sound was enormous, a declaration, a thing you felt in your teeth and your sternum and the soles of your feet. 50 machines, 50 engines, the whole charter, and 3 more besides. Riders who had come from 2 states over, because the road captain had put out the word that a debt was being paid today, the kind that cannot be measured. And every man and woman among them understood that there is no higher call than that one. They did not roar up to the steps and make a show. That was the thing Marcus never forgot. They came in slow, and they killed the engines all at once. A sudden enormous silence that was louder than the thunder had been, and they dismounted in an unhurried wall of leather, and at the front of them, walking with the careful gait of a man whose ribs had not entirely forgiven a December, came Tombstone. He did not look at the boy. Not yet. He walked up the courthouse steps with the woman who had once been an accountant at his shoulder, carrying a thick folder, and he stopped in front of the county clerk, who had gone the color of the December sky, and he said in a voice like gravel poured slow, "Don't start that auction yet." This is a legal proceeding," the clerk managed. "It is," Tombstone agreed. "That's what we're here about, the legal part." He nodded at the woman beside him, and she opened the folder, and she began to lay paper on the clerk's table, sheet after sheet, dates and dollars and names, the clerk in the assessor's office and his brother-in-law, the shell company and its 3 layers, the code inspector's contract, the whole elegant machine laid out in the cold, flat language Gerald Voss himself loved best, except now it was pointed the other way. "You're going to want to make a phone call before you bring that gavel down," Tombstone said, "to whoever sent that gentleman in the brown suit. You're going to want to read him these names. And then you're going to want to ask him whether he'd like all of this to be a quiet thing, settled today, or a loud thing, settled by the men with the badges who don't answer to him in front of every camera I can call, and I can call a great many." The brown suit was already on his phone, turned away, his shoulders up around his ears. The ash saints stood in the spring sun and did nothing at all, which was the most frightening thing they could have done. 50 people, simply present, simply watching, simply waiting, the wall of them throwing a long shadow across the courthouse steps. Gerald Voss arrived 20 minutes later. He came himself, after all. The machine had failed. And so the man had to come out into the cold he had spent his life avoiding. And he came in the gun-gray German car, and he got out fast and angry and certain, a man who had never lost, striding toward the steps in his slate suit with his lawyer trailing behind. And he got within 30 feet of the wall of leather, and he stopped. He stopped because the wall did not move. It simply looked at him. "What is this?" Voss said. His voice was still smooth, but it had a thing in it now that had not been there in room 14. "Who are these people? This is a legal sale. I have every right." "You have a folder," Tombstone said. He did not raise his voice. He came down 2 steps slow, one hand resting on the rail, his ribs still kneaded, and he stood above the suited man and looked down at him. "It's got your name on it, every clerk you bought, every fee you invented, the inspector, the brother-in-law, the whole thing. He let it sit. We made copies. They're in a lot of places. Places you can't reach with a phone call or a checkbook, because the people holding them don't want anything you have. That's the part you never learned, isn't it? There are people in the world who don't want anything you have." Voss's lawyer leaned in and whispered something. Voss waved him off, but his eyes had begun to move. Fast. The eyes of a man doing arithmetic for the first time in his life and not liking the answer, and Marcus, watching from the steps, saw the exact moment the man understood. It was the same look the old man's eyes had done in the doorway in December, but inverted, a thing he had stopped believing and turning out to be false. Voss had believed his armor was the world itself. And here were 50 people who lived outside that world entirely, who could not be fired, foreclosed, sued into silence, or bought. And his armor was suddenly just an expensive suit standing in a parking lot, and he was under it only a soft man in the cold. "You're going to withdraw the bid," Tombstone said. "You're going to release the penalties on Mrs. Petrowski's house, the ones your clerk invented today in writing. You're going to let this block alone. The widow, the woman from the motel, the boy, all of it. You walk away clean and quiet, and we never met." He paused. "Or you don't. And tomorrow, this folder is on the desk of every reporter and every state investigator whose number we've got. And you spend the next 10 years explaining shell companies to men who can't be paid to look away your choice. You've got till that clerk finds his nerve." It was not a threat of violence. There was not a weapon in sight, not a fist raised, nothing a single one of those 50 people could be charged with. It was something worse for a man like Voss. It was the truth, written down, held by people he could not touch, delivered by a man who did not want his money. The whole architecture of his life had been built on the certainty that everything could be bought or broken or buried, and it could not survive contact with even one thing that could not. Gerald Voss looked at the folder. He looked at the wall of leather. He looked, last, at the boy on the steps, the thin boy in a dead man's barn coat who had told him to get out of his mother's room, and whatever he had been about to say died behind his perfect teeth, and what was left in his face was not contempt, not curiosity. It was fear, plain and total. The fear of a man who has just learned the floor he stood on was never there. He withdrew the bid. His lawyer drew up the release of Ruth Petrowski's invented penalties on the hood of the gun-gray car, and Voss signed it with a hand that was not entirely steady, and the woman who had once been an accountant read it twice before she nodded. And then Gerald Voss got back into his expensive car, and he drove away into the bright April sun. The same blinding, ordinary daylight his whole world was made of, and the difference was that now it looked like what it was, which was an empty street with a small man driving fast to get out of it. He never came back to Cold Harbor. He sold his holdings within the year quietly at a loss to a man no one had heard of, and the block stayed where it was. That all came later. On the courthouse steps in the spring sun, the silence after he left lasted only a moment. Then Tombstone turned around, and finally, for the first time, he looked at the boy. He came up the steps slow, and the wall of leather behind him said nothing, and he stopped in front of Marcus Hale, who was crying now. Finally, the held breath of 4 months going out of him all at once, and the old man looked down at the boy who had carried him 40 feet across the ice and asked for nothing. "You wrote me a letter," Tombstone said. "Said the debt was square. Said you weren't asking for anything for yourself." He reached out and gripped the back of the boy's neck, the way you steady a colt, the way he had in the doorway, and held it there. "You were wrong about that, kid. About it being square. A thing freely given can't be paid back. It can only be passed on." He looked past the boy at Dana and at Ruth Petrosky, and at the 30 people from the block, and at the 50 riders behind him, and his weathered face did a thing it did not do often. That's the whole code. That's all it ever was. You already knew it. You knew it in that doorway. We just rode up to say it out loud. He took something out of his vest then. It was not money. It was a small worn patch, hand-stitched, an ash-gray field with a single thin tree on it. The mark the Ash Saints gave to people who were not members and never would be, but were theirs all the same, the ones the club had decided to keep. He pressed it into the boy's red hand and closed the boy's fingers over it, the way Dana had closed his fingers over $300 in January. "Anybody who touches this block," Tombstone said, loud enough now for the whole street to hear, loud enough for the windows to carry it, "touches us. You tell them that. You tell them the boy with the shovel is ours." The Ash Saints stayed the whole day. They were not what the town had feared. Rolling up. They fixed Ruth Petrosky's condemned railing in an afternoon. The retired machinist and 2 others, good work that would pass any inspector honest enough to look. They ate everything in Dana's kitchen and left it stocked twice over. The man who had come home wrong from 2 tours sat on the porch steps with Marcus a long time and did not say much, which was its own kind of saying. And in the evening, before they rode out, Tombstone found the boy alone by the bikes, Chrome catching the last of the light. "You ride," the old man said. "No, sir, you will. When you're old enough and your mother says yes and not 1 day before, you understand me, but you will." He looked out at the valley, going gold and blue with the coming dark. "There's a seat for you down the road, kid, whenever you want it. No hurry. The road waits." Then they were thunder again, 50 engines waking at once and rolling out of Cold Harbor in the long spring dusk, chrome and leather and the low-fading thunder of them, and the windows shook and the pigeons went up. And then they were gone, and the town was very quiet, and the snow was gone for good, and it was spring. Marcus stood in the street until he could not hear them any more. His mother came out and stood beside him, and Ruth Petrosky came out onto her newly solid front steps, and the 3 of them watched the empty road where the thunder had been, and no one said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. That night, Marcus hung the gray patch on a nail by the front door where the dead man's barn coat hung, and he stood and looked at it a while. "Sah!" Outside, the last of the runoff dripped off the eaves, the sound of the mountains letting go of winter, His hands were warm for the first time in months. He thought about the doorway in December and the 11 minutes across the ice, and the man asking, "What do I owe you?" and the boy saying nothing. And the boy had meant it. He had meant it then, and he meant it now. But he understood at last what the old man had been trying to tell him on the courthouse steps. You do not give a thing away to be paid back. You give it away because the cold is real and someone is in it. And then, if you are very lucky, you find out you were never as alone in the cold as you believed. He touched the patch once, the thin gray tree under his thumb, and then he went to find his mother, who was at the kitchen table with the bills fanned out. Except tonight, she was not staring at them like a hen she could not win. Tonight she was just adding them up, ordinary, the heat staying on, and when Marcus sat down across from her, she looked up, and there was something in her face he had not seen in years. And it took him a moment to name it, and the name was rest. If this story warmed something in you, if you have ever been cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather and found a hand on the back of your neck when you least expected it, stay a moment longer with that feeling before you go. Carry it out into your own street. And if you would like more stories of the people the world overlooks and the unlikely ones who refuse to let them stand alone in the cold, you know what to do. We will be here. The road waits.